A mile from anywhere, her dog stopped cold on the trail, turned, and tore off into the snow toward something no one could see. Buried beneath the brush lay a man the winter had nearly finished, barely breathing, one fist frozen shut, around a small black drive. His eyes opened, found her face, and he spent his last bit of strength on 5 words. "Don't call it in." Then, "Someone inside is listening." She had given her life to a system she could no longer trust, and the only thing she could trust now had 4 legs and a nose for the truth. The trail had no name that Jessica Hayes knew, and that was exactly why she'd chosen it. 3 miles out of the cabin, past the last mailbox and the last set of tire tracks, the world narrowed to white. Snow had come down hard the night before, soft and total, and now the morning held the kind of silence that pressed against the ears. Pines stood heavy under it. The light was thin and gray, the color of a sky that hadn't decided whether to clear. She walked without her phone in her hand. That was the rule she'd made for herself out here. The phone stayed zipped in the inside pocket of her coat, against her ribs, where she could pretend to forget it. For 11 days she'd kept that rule, and for 11 days the forgetting had not quite taken. Wren moved ahead of her the way he always did, a dark shape against the snow, ears up, tail level. The German Shepherd was 4 years old and had spent most of those years working, and he did not know how to take a walk the way other dogs did. He read the ground. He read the wind. Every few yards he lifted his nose and tested the air, and Jessica had stopped finding it strange, because Wren had been finding things his whole life, and she had never once told him to quit. She was thinking about nothing, or trying to, when the dog stopped. He didn't slow. He stopped all at once, one paw lifted, his whole body gone rigid in the middle of the path. Jessica knew that shape. She'd seen it across rooms and across fields, and once across a parking garage that still woke her up some nights. It was the shape Wren made when the world had handed him something the rest of them couldn't see yet. Wren. He didn't look back. His head turned a few degrees into the wind, and then he broke off the trail, plunging through the drift toward a stand of low brush where the snow had piled into soft blue shadow. The leash paid out fast through her glove. "Wren, hold up." She went after him because there was nothing else to do, snow swallowing her boots to the shin, breath clouding and tearing away. The dog had his nose down in the brush now, and he was working hard, the way he worked when the thing he'd found was the thing that mattered. A low sound came out of him, not a bark, something older than a bark. Then she saw the boot. It was canted at a wrong angle, half buried, and above it a leg, and above that the rest of a man folded into the hollow beneath the brush as though he had been set down there and left. For a half-second her mind tried to make him into a fallen branch, a trick of shadow, anything but what he was. The half-second passed. She was already on her knees in the snow. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, and the cold had done its slow work on him. His lips had gone the color of the sky. Frost had built in the stubble along his jaw. When she pressed 2 fingers under the line of it, the pulse she found was there but far away, a slow knock at a door from the bottom of a long stairwell. His eyes were shut. His skin had the waxen stillness of a man the winter had nearly finished with, and yet his chest rose, once and fell, and rose again. "Hey, hey, can you hear me?" She had his collar in her fist, then his shoulder. "Stay with me. Open your eyes." Nothing. But the breath kept coming, stubborn and shallow, and that was something to build on. She'd carried people before. Not like this, not through snow with the light failing and a dog circling, but the body remembered the mechanics of it. She got an arm beneath his back and another behind his knees, and she found out fast that wanting to lift him and lifting him were 2 different facts. He had to help. She slapped his cheek, not gently, and said his absence of a name in the only words she had. "Come on, soldier, you don't get to quit out here." And whether it was the cold of her glove or the command in her voice, his eyes cracked open a sliver, gray and unfocused, and his legs took some of his own weight, and between the 2 of them they got him up. The cabin was the longest mile of her life. Wren ran point the whole way, breaking trail, looping back, breaking trail again, and twice, when the man's knees buckled, the dog was simply there against his side like a post driven into the ground. By the time the porch came into view, her shoulders were screaming, and the light had gone the color of slate. Inside, she got him onto the floor by the wood stove, because the bed was too far. She stripped the wet shell off him and got the fire roaring and built a wall of every blanket the cabin owned, and she put the kettle on for the bottles. And she did all of it in the flat, unhurried hurry she'd been trained into a long time ago. The part of her that didn't panic because panic was a luxury for people with time. Warm the core first, not the hands. Not the feet. The core. She'd had that drilled into her in a classroom that felt like another planet from this one. The man's breathing deepened by degrees. Color crept back into his lips. And it was somewhere in that hour, kneeling beside him with the fire popping and Wren pressed to her hip, that she let herself believe he might actually live. Wren would not leave his side. That was the first thing she noticed once her own hands stopped shaking. The dog had his nose buried against the man's forearm and would not lift it, and a low note kept rolling out of his chest, not a growl exactly, but close to one, the sound he made when something was wrong in a way he didn't have words for. She'd assumed the man smelled like the woods, like cold and pine and the long night he'd spent in it. He didn't. When she leaned close, the smell came up off his sleeve and stopped her cold. It was the bitter mineral tang of spent powder, old smoke ground into the fabric. Under it, the flat copper note of a hard impact. And under that, fainter, the chemical sweetness of something she couldn't place but knew, deep in the part of her brain that had spent years learning what wrong smelled like, that it did not belong on a man who had simply lost his footing on a mountain. Wren had it too. Wren had had it the whole time. This man hadn't fallen. This man had been done to. His right hand had not opened the entire time. She'd worked around it, warmed everything but that one fist, and now she pried at the frozen fingers one by one, gentle, until they gave. In his palm, slick with melt, lay a small black drive, the kind that fit a pocket, the kind that held the kind of thing men got left in the snow over. His eyes opened, not the unfocused sliver from the trail. They found her face and held it, and there was a whole mind behind them, awake and afraid and counting. His mouth moved. She bent close. "Don't," he said, and the word cost him everything. He swallowed and tried again, a thread of sound. "Don't call it in." His fingers closed back over the drive, over her hand, around it. Someone inside is listening. Then the light went out of his face, and his head went slack against the blankets, and he was under again, breathing, alive, gone somewhere she couldn't follow. Jessica knelt very still. Outside the window the snow had started again, fat and silent, erasing the trail they'd come in on. The fire threw its red light across the man's face and across the dog who would not leave him and across her own hand, which had come up out of her coat without her telling it to. The phone was in it. Her thumb had already found the 3 numbers. They glowed there on the screen, the whole apparatus of help she'd spent her career believing in, one press away. She did not press it. He surfaced slowly over the next 2 days, the way a man comes up from deep water, in stages, with long stretches of dark in between. Jessica learned the shape of his recovery before she learned anything else about him. The first afternoon he managed water and a few words that made no sense. The second morning he ate half a bowl of broth and watched her the entire time he did it, and she understood that the watching was not gratitude. It was inventory. He was counting exits, counting her, counting the dog, building a map of the room the way she would have built one. "You're not panicking," he said. His voice had come back rough but steady. "Most people who pull a stranger out of a snowbank panic somewhere in the first day. I had things to do. That's not an answer." He shifted against the blankets, testing his ribs, and the test cost him. "People who don't panic are either stupid or trained. You don't look stupid." Jessica set the bowl down. Rin lay between them on the floorboards, head on his paws, eyes open, and she had noticed that the dog had stopped growling at the man sometime in the night and had not yet decided what to feel instead. "FBI," she said. "I'm on leave." Something moved behind his face. Not relief. Closer to the opposite. "Leave," he repeated. "Voluntary? Does it matter?" "It matters more than almost anything you could have told me." He let his head go back against the wall and shut his eyes, and for a moment she thought he'd gone under again. Then, "Cole Bennett. I used to be Navy. Used to be. Now I'm the guy people hire when they need something looked at, and they can't use the people who'd normally look at it." "A contract investigator?" "A fancy way of saying nobody official wants their name on what I do." He opened his eyes. "Somebody hired me to walk through the money of a company called Apex Athletic Group. Sponsorships, youth programs, the whole pipeline. They thought money was going somewhere it shouldn't. They were right. It was going a lot of places it shouldn't, and I followed it. And 3 nights ago, on the pass above the lake, 2 men I never heard come up behind me, made sure I'd stop following it." He said it flat, the way men say the things that have teeth. Jessica didn't fill the silence after it. She'd learned a long time ago that the silence did more work than any question. "They didn't use a weapon that makes noise," Cole went on. "No shot, nothing a coroner pulls out of a man. They worked me over and put me in the brush off the trail and let the mountain do the rest. By morning, I'd just be a guy who went hiking and didn't come back. Happens up here. Nobody looks twice." His jaw tightened. "It almost worked. I don't remember the snow. I don't remember your dog. I remember waking up warm and thinking that was the part that didn't make sense." Rin's ears came up at dog. Jessica put a hand flat on his back. "You said something when you woke up," she said. "You said don't call it in. You said someone inside is listening." "I did." "Inside what?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him decide how much of his life to hand to a stranger with a badge she wasn't currently carrying. "Inside everything," he said. "That's the part that should scare you. When something this size is moving money and burying men, it doesn't survive without somebody on the clean side of the fence looking the other way. You make one call to the wrong field office, the wrong prosecutor, the wrong anybody, and the next snowbank is yours." And here was the thing Jessica had not said to him, the thing she had not said out loud to anyone. The case that had ended her run and put her up here in the cold had ended because something inside it had leaked. Not a guess. A fact she'd lived. A surveillance package that should have closed a door had instead opened one, somewhere she couldn't see, and a man who should be in a cell was not, and to this day she did not know which hand had turned which knob. She'd come up the mountain to stop thinking about it. She had not managed to stop for 1 full hour. So when Cole Bennett told her not to trust the system she'd given her adult life to, the part of her that should have argued didn't, because she didn't know who to call either. That was the whole truth of why she was hiding in a cabin. She had stopped knowing which of her own people were her own people. "All right," she said. "All right what?" "All right, we don't call it in." She heard herself say we and didn't take it back. "Not until I can see the whole shape of it. Not until I know which call is safe." She nodded at the drive, sitting where she'd left it on the mantel since the morning she'd pried it out of his hand. Start there. It took most of the afternoon to get into it. The drive was locked behind a passphrase, and Cole's first 3 attempts failed, and on the 4th his hands were shaking too hard from the effort of sitting up, so Jessica typed while he spoke the characters one at a time. The folder that opened was nothing she'd hoped for and everything she'd feared, a tangle of spreadsheets and scanned documents and audio files named only by date. She played the most recent one. It filled the cabin before she was ready for it. A man's voice, smooth and unhurried and entirely at ease, the voice of someone who had never once in his life been the smaller party in a room. He was talking to someone she couldn't hear, only the one side, and he was not raising it, and that was what made the back of her neck go cold. He was explaining patiently the way you'd explain a schedule, exactly how much a reputation was worth, and exactly what it would cost to keep a certain story from reaching a certain podium. He used the word arrangement. He used the word unfortunate. He never once used a word a court could call a threat, and every single word was a threat, and the man saying them knew it and loved it. The recording ended. The fire ticked. Outside, the snow had kept up its work all afternoon, and the window held nothing now but white. Neither of them spoke for a while. Ryn had lifted his head at the voice and put it back down. "You hear it," Cole said finally. "The thing he never says? I hear it." That's a man who's done this enough times to know exactly where the line is. He's standing right on it. "Both feet." He let out a slow breath. "I pulled his name off a wire transfer 3 companies deep. Took me a week to be sure it was really him on the other end of these calls." "Who is he?" "Adrian Voss." Cole said the name like it tasted wrong. "Lawyer, the kind who hasn't seen a courtroom in years because the work he does now never goes near one. Companies in trouble, families in trouble, anybody with something to hide and money to spend keeping it hidden. He calls himself a negotiator." A short, joyless sound. "He's a man who found out you can rob people with a sentence instead of a weapon, and that the sentence is legal if you build it right." Jessica was already on her feet. There was a roll of butcher paper in the closet, left over from some long-gone tenant, and she tore a length of it and pinned it to the cabin wall with 2 nails she found in a coffee can, and she wrote Adrian Voss at the top of it in marker, and under it Apex and a line between them. It was a child's version of the wall she'd have built at the office. It would have to do. The act of building it settled something in her chest that hadn't been settled in 11 days. She had a thread again. She had a place to pull. "You should be resting," she said, not looking away from the paper. "I rested for 3 days while you carried me around. I'm done resting." He worked himself up straighter against the wall, slow, careful of the ribs. "What are you writing him next to?" "Everything we find." "That's how it works." She capped the marker. "Right now, he's the only name on the board. He won't be for long. Men like this don't operate alone. There's always—" Ryn moved. He came up off the floor in one motion, no sound, and crossed to the window with his hackles standing in a hard ridge from his shoulders to his tail. His whole body had gone forward, weight on the front paws, the growl building in him low and continuous, aimed out at the white. Jessica had the marker down and her hand on the dog's collar before she'd finished the thought. Through the glass the snow had finally thinned. The trail they'd come in on 3 days ago was long gone under fresh powder, smooth and untouched, all the way to the tree line. All the way except for one place. Down where the access road met the foot of the property, cut clean across the new snow, ran a single set of tire tracks. Fresh. Not theirs. Hers was the only vehicle, and it sat buried where she'd left it. Someone had driven up to the edge of the property, slowed and turned around, close enough to see the smoke coming off the cabin chimney, close enough to know that the lights inside were on. And then, before either of them had come up the mountain, driven calmly away. The 4th day brought clear sky and a cold so sharp it had edges. Cole could stand now, could cross the room with one hand trailing the wall, and he spent the morning doing exactly that, back and forth, rebuilding the body the pass had taken from him. Jessica spent the morning inside the drive. She'd done this work before, in rooms with better light and worse coffee, and the muscle of it came back fast. You didn't start with the loud thing, you started with the boring thing. She left the audio alone and went into the spreadsheets, because money never lied the way voices did. Money just sat there and let you read it. By noon she had the shape of Voss's machine, and it was uglier for how clean it was. "He's not stealing," she said. Cole eased down onto the bench beside the table, careful of the ribs. I keep waiting to find him stealing, and it's not there. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" "It's worse." She turned the laptop so he could see. "Apex has a problem. Their youth program, the one that feeds talent up the pipeline, it's dirty. Payments to families that aren't supposed to exist. Coaches getting paid to steer kids toward the brand. If it ever got out, the sponsors walk, the program folds, the stock takes a fall it might not get up from." She tapped the screen. "Voss found out, and he didn't take it to anybody. He took it to Apex." Cole was quiet a moment. "He's selling them their own secret back." "He's selling them silence. He sat down across from people who could ruin them, and he explained, very politely, exactly what it would cost to make sure the story never reaches a microphone. Tens of millions, some of it framed as a fee for an internal review he'd run himself, so it looks like consulting on paper." She sat back. "Every dollar has a reason printed next to it. Every reason is a lie, and every lie is dressed up well enough to survive a first look. That's the whole trick. He builds it so the daylight bounces right off." "So you've got him?" "No." And this was the part that had been gnawing at her since the broth went cold. "That's what's been eating me all morning. I've got a man who's very good at standing on the right side of a line. The recording, the one we heard, a defense lawyer would have a field day with it. He never names a threat. He talks about reputations and arrangements and unfortunate outcomes. On paper, he's a consultant having a hard conversation." She shook her head slowly. "To put him away, you can't just prove he said the words. You have to prove what he meant by them. You have to prove intent. And intent doesn't live in a spreadsheet?" Cole studied the screen. "Where does it live?" "In the pattern, in the timing, in one moment where the mask slips and he says the quiet part where a recorder can reach it." She rubbed her eyes. "Which means the drive in your pocket isn't the finish line. It's the first room of a much bigger house." She got up and went to the paper on the wall and stood in front of it. Voss, Apex, the line between them. She'd thought the morning would let her add 3 names and feel the case grow. Instead, the case had gotten simpler and somehow more frightening, the way a thing gets frightening when you realize how much of it is built on purpose. "Here's what I can't make fit," she said, "a scheme this size, running this long. You don't keep that quiet on luck. He's been doing this for years, Cole. Years. And a man who shakes down companies with the threat of going public, sooner or later, one of those companies does the smart thing and calls a prosecutor instead of paying. It happens. It's the one move that ends him." She turned around. "So why hasn't it? Why is Adrian Voss still walking around free, still making these calls, when the math says somebody should have handed him to a grand jury a long time ago?" The question hung in the cold air. "Because somebody made sure they didn't," Cole said. "Because somebody made sure they didn't." She felt the floor of the case shift under her, the way it had in the parking garage, the way it had 11 days before everything went wrong the last time. This isn't one bad lawyer. A bad lawyer gets caught. This is a bad lawyer with a friend somewhere. The complaints go to die. Somebody who sees the cases come in and points them away from him before they get traction. She looked back at the wall, at the small, dumb diagram of it. "Somebody inside. You said it the first morning. I didn't want to hear it." She went back to the drive with a different hunger now. Not the spreadsheets, the scans. There were photographs in there, dozens of them, the kind a surveillance shooter takes from a parked car, and most of them were nothing. Voss leaving a building, Voss in a restaurant, Voss shaking a hand. She'd skimmed them once and moved on. Now she went through them one at a time, slow, the way you go through the boring evidence the second time, when the boring evidence is the only place the answer can be hiding. It was past 4 when she found it. The light had gone long and amber through the cabin window, and she'd turned the laptop's brightness up against it, and that was why the glow lit her face the way it did when the frame finally stopped her. A restaurant? A private corner, shot through glass from across a street. Voss at the table, mid-sentence, that easy, unbothered face. and across from him, leaning in close, close enough that the conversation was clearly not a chance encounter, close enough that her hand rested on the table beside his, sat a woman Jessica knew. Not personally, by reputation, by the way her name showed up in the case files of people who got away. She enlarged the frame until the pixels swam and the amber light moved across her own face, and she stopped breathing for a second. The way you do when a door you were looking for turns out to have been behind you the whole time. "Cole?" Her voice had gone very flat. "Come look at this." He crossed the room. She felt him go still behind her shoulder. "You know her?" he asked. "Everybody in my world knows her." Jessica didn't take her eyes off the screen. "That's a federal prosecutor, a senior one. She has decided which cases live and which cases die for a long time, and people have wondered quietly, in the kind of rooms I used to sit in, why some of her decisions went the way they did." Her mouth was dry. "And she is sitting 2 feet from Adrian Voss, in a corner nobody's supposed to see, looking like the oldest friend he has." Behind them, on the floor, Rin lifted his head off his paws. He didn't growl this time. He rose, slow, and walked to the window, and stood there with his nose almost touching the glass, ears swiveled forward, his whole attention fixed on the tree line where the light was failing. Not the road this time. The trees. Something out past the cleared ground where a person could stand in the dark of the pines and watch a lit window and not be seen. Cole saw it too, the dog's focus, and something changed in the way he held himself. He stepped back from the screen and to the side of the window, out of the frame of it, and he looked out at the tree line with a different kind of attention than Jessica had, a soldier's attention, reading the snow for the shape that didn't belong. "There was a man on the pass," he said quietly. "Behind the one who put me down. He didn't do any of the work. He just watched, stood still and watched, and let the other one do it. His jaw worked. The way somebody stands when standing still is the job. I've been trying to remember why that bothered me." He nodded at the dark line of trees. "Your dog's looking at the same thing right now." Jessica's eyes went back to the screen, to the woman leaning toward Voss in the amber light, to the name surfacing now out of every file she'd ever heard it buried in. "Renee Caldwell," she said. They moved off the mountain on the 6th day because a cabin with one road in was a box, and Cole had spent enough of his life knowing the difference between cover and a trap. Jessica drove them down to a motel on the edge of a town she'd never named to anyone, the kind of place that took cash and asked nothing, and Rin rode in the back with his chin on the seat between them the whole way down, watching the mirrors like he'd been taught to. The room smelled like old carpet and older smoke, and it had 2 beds and a desk, and the desk was where Jessica built the next wall. Not paper this time. Index cards, a pack of them from a gas station, and she pinned them to the cork strip above the desk, and she put Caldwell in the center, because Caldwell was the lock now, not Voss. "Voss is the loud one," she said. "He's the one you'd put on a poster, but he's not the one holding this together. She is." She tapped the card. "A prosecutor doesn't just look the other way for free. Nobody does that for free. Either she's getting paid or she's getting squeezed. And I've been doing this long enough to tell you the squeezed ones are the dangerous ones because the squeezed ones are looking for a way out, and a person looking for a way out will do something stupid and brave if you give them the door." It took 2 days to find the door. It was Cole who found it in the end, going back through the scans with the patience of a man who had nothing to do but heal and read. Buried in the drive between the surveillance photos and the wire records sat a scanned form, a financial hardship withdrawal filed with a public retirement plan 2 years old. A request to pull money early out of a fund that wasn't supposed to be touched on the grounds that the person filing had suffered a serious financial setback. The person who'd filed it was Renee Caldwell. "Read the bottom," Cole said. Jessica read the bottom. Under the last line, above the signature, ran a single sentence in the small gray type these forms always used. I declare under penalty of perjury that the foregoing is true and correct. And beside it, a box, and in the box, a check mark, and below it, her name in her own hand. She lied, Jessica said slowly. She said she had a hardship. She didn't. Look at her income that year. She pulled the figures Cole had already flagged. She was making $250,000. There was no hardship. She wanted the money for something else, and she swore there was, under penalty of perjury, to get at it early. She sat back. It's nothing, a paperwork lie. 2 years ago, a checkbox on a form nobody reads. It doesn't look like nothing on your face? Because it isn't. She picked the page up off the desk and held it, and that was the moment the whole shape of it landed on her. The page weighed nothing. It was a single sheet, thin enough to see the desk lamp through, and the check mark in the box was the smallest mark a person could make. And it was the heaviest thing she had touched since this began. Heavier than the drive. Heavier than the recording. A federal prosecutor, a woman who had stood in front of juries and asked them to send people away on the strength of a sworn word, had been brought to heel by one of her own. One checkbox, one signature, one sentence she'd read 10,000 times in other people's cases and never once thought would close around her own wrist. This is the leash, Jessica said. Whoever has this form owns her. The day she signed it, she handed somebody the power to end her career and her freedom in one phone call, and somebody used it. She set the page down very carefully, the way you set down something that could go off. She's not the architect, Cole. She's a prisoner with a key to the building. That changes how we go at her. You're not going to arrest her. I couldn't if I wanted to. I'm on leave with no warrant and no chain of custody for any of this. She shook her head. No, I'm going to do the one thing nobody's done for her in 2 years. I'm going to offer her the door instead of the threat. She reached Caldwell on the 3rd try on a number Cole pulled from a filing, and she said almost nothing on the call, only enough, only that she had seen a form with a check mark in it, and that she was not the person Caldwell was afraid of, and that there was a version of the next month where Caldwell walked toward something instead of away from it. Then she gave a place and a time and hung up before Caldwell could decide to be brave the wrong way. The prosecutor came alone. That told Jessica most of what she needed to know before a word was spoken. A guilty person who is only guilty brings a lawyer. A person drowning comes alone because somewhere underneath the fear they've been waiting for somebody to throw the rope. They met in a diner 2 towns over, a corner booth, Wren in the truck with the windows cracked. Caldwell was smaller in person than her reputation and tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and when Jessica slid the copy of the form across the table, the woman looked at it and did not pretend. I knew the day I signed it, Caldwell said. Her voice was steady, and that steadiness cost her. You read that sentence to defendants your whole career, and you think you'd never. And then your life cracks in a place you didn't plan for, and there's money sitting right there, behind one little box. She pushed the page back an inch. 6 months later, a man I'd never met sent me a copy of it, in an envelope with no note. Didn't have to write anything. I understood the envelope. Voss. Voss is the front. Voss is the charm. Caldwell's hands were flat on the table to keep them still. Voss never sent the envelope. Voss doesn't get his hands near the dirty part. There's a man who does that part, the one who keeps the forms and the photographs and the names. He's been doing it since before any of us. He went away once, years back, for leaning on people, and he came out and went right back to being the one who holds what everybody's afraid of. He has a name. Caldwell looked at the window for a long moment. Outside, the cold had gone blue with evening. Sal Marone, she said. And then, because she had clearly decided that if she was going to jump, she was going all the way down, she told them the rest. That Marone was the spine of it, the one who'd built the whole architecture of held secrets and quiet leashes. That she was not the only prosecutor with an envelope. and that none of it mattered for very much longer, because Sal Marone had finally outlived his usefulness to the people above him, and somebody had arranged for him to be subpoenaed in front of a grand jury, granted immunity, and put on a chair where he would have to either talk or refuse, and that the date for it was set, and that it was 11 days away. "They want him in that chair," Caldwell said quietly. "And they want him to never reach it. Both. The men he built all this for would rather he were gone than be the one deciding what gets said under oath." She finally met Jessica's eyes. "He knows everything. He's also the most dangerous man in this to keep alive, because the same people I'm afraid of are the people who'd make sure he never testifies. You want the thing that ends all of it? It's a tired old man on a witness list with a target on him and 11 days left." It was full dark by the time they got back. Jessica killed the headlights at the bottom of the access road, out of an instinct she didn't examine, and they rolled the last 100 yards to the motel on the parking lights alone. Cole had been quiet the whole drive. He'd gone quiet in a particular way somewhere around the diner. A stillness Jessica was starting to learn meant his mind had hold of something and wouldn't let go. As they pulled in, a second vehicle sat in the far corner of the lot that hadn't been there that morning. Dark, engine off. A man in the driver's seat, not moving, the way a person sits when sitting still is the work. She felt Cole go rigid in the passenger seat. "That's him," he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "That's the one from the pass, the one who watched." His hand found the door handle and stopped there. "He didn't come to watch this time." In the back, Ryn came up off the seat without a sound, his whole body turned toward the dark car, the growl already building low in his chest. The man in the dark car did not move on them that night. He let the engine sit cold and he watched the motel windows for an hour. And then he drove away slow, and that was worse than if he'd come, because it meant he was not in a hurry, and men who are not in a hurry are men who already know how the night ends. "He was counting us," Cole said, watching the taillights thin out down the road. "How many? Which room? Where the dog sleeps? He'll come back when the math is in his favor." He turned from the window. "We don't have 11 days. We have however long it takes them to decide Marone's worth more in the ground than in the chair, and after tonight, that clock just got faster." So they went to find Sal Marone first. Caldwell gave them the where, a safe house the marshals didn't know about, an arrangement Marone had made for himself years ago against exactly this kind of week. It sat at the end of a private drive up in the pines, an hour past the last plowed road, and they took it slow in the dark with Ryn's nose to the cracked window the whole way, reading the cold air for anything that didn't belong in it. Marone opened the door before they knocked, a shotgun held loose and unthreatening at his side, the way a man holds a thing he's tired of needing. He was old, older than his file. The years had gone into his face and taken something out of it, and what was left was a man who had spent his whole life holding other people's secrets and had finally run out of room to hold his own. "FBI," he said, looking at Jessica, not asking. "And a soldier somebody already tried to bury." His eyes moved to Cole and stayed a beat. "You're the one from the pass. They told me a contractor got too close and got handled. They didn't tell me he walked out of it." A dry sound that might have been a laugh once. "Come in before you let the heat out. I've got 8 days, and I'd rather not spend them cold." Inside, over coffee gone bitter on the burner, he laid it out for them, and it was the loneliest piece of arithmetic Jessica had ever heard a man do about his own life. "I can do 3 things in that chair," Marone said. He held up a thick finger for each. "I can tell the truth, the whole architecture, every name, every envelope, who built it and who fed it. I do that, and the men I'd be naming make sure I don't see the building I'd be testifying in. They've already decided. The car outside your motel was them deciding." He folded the finger down. "I can refuse, sit there and say nothing. But they gave me immunity. You understand what that means? Immunity means I can't hide behind my own protection anymore. I refuse to answer. That's contempt, and contempt is a cell, and a cell is the easiest place in the world for a tired old man to have an accident. Second finger down. Or, he looked at the third finger a long time. Or I can lie. Get up there and say I don't remember. I was never involved. It was all somebody else. And the second I do that, it's perjury, and the same immunity that won't let me stay silent makes the lie a brand new crime they can hang me with. The third finger came down into a fist. Truth gets me gone. Silence gets me caged. A lie gets me jailed. That's the box they built. 3 walls and a floor, and they're standing on the lid. There's a fourth thing, Jessica said. Moroni looked at her with the patience of a man who had heard a great many fourth things. You tell the truth, she said, and you live to do it. We close the distance between you and that chair so tight there's no room left for an accident. And the thing that protects you isn't us standing in the way of them. It's the thing that makes them too late. She set the drive on the table between them. There's a recording on here. Voss doing the only thing Voss does, talking to a company he's bleeding. By itself, it's not enough. A lawyer talks his way out of it. But you put that recording next to your testimony, next to Caldwell's form, next to a prosecutor who's ready to stand up and say she was leashed and by whom, and the 3 of them together don't leave a thread for anybody to pull. The day all 3 exist in the same room, killing you stops buying them anything. You become the least useful man to take a shot at in the entire country. She held his eyes. Right now, you're worth more gone. We make you worth more alive. That's the only protection that's ever held. The old man was quiet for a long while. The coffee ticked on the burner. You'd need all 3, he said. The tape proven, the prosecutor turned, and me in the chair. Miss 1 and the other 2 are just loose ends with my name on them. Then we don't miss one. They almost did. It was Cole who felt it first, or maybe it was Rynn, the 2 of them on the same wire by now. They were loading to move Moroni to a place closer to the courthouse, gray dawn just starting to grain the snow, when the dog came up off the porch boards in a single hard line of muscle and bolted, not toward the cars, but sideways, fast, cutting across the open ground toward the tree line with the snow flying off his paws. Down, Cole said, and he had Jessica and the old man behind the engine block of the truck before the word was finished, and that half-second the dog had bought them was the half-second that mattered, because Rynn had not run at nothing. The wind had been coming downslope off the pines all morning into their faces, carrying the cold and the scent of 2 men who'd come up the back of the ridge on foot in the dark and gone still in the brush to wait for the doors to open. The dog had caught them on the air a beat before they were ready, before they had the angle they wanted, and his bolt across the snow had turned 2 patient hunters into 2 men who had to move early, into the open, off their mark. What happened after happened fast, and Jessica would only assemble it later in pieces. The crack of the cold, the truck taking the hits, meant for the men behind it, Cole moving with a speed his ribs should not have allowed, the old man surprisingly steady with the shotgun he'd never quite set down. One of the 2 went down into the snow and did not get up, his strength leaving him into the white, and the other, the patient one, the one from the pass and the parking lot and the motel, made it back to the tree line and was gone into the gray. And Rynn came trotting back across the open ground, with his ears up and his tail level, unhurt, having done the one thing 7 years of someone's training had built into his blood, which was to find the danger on the wind before it found the people he'd decided were his. Jessica knelt in the snow and put both hands on either side of the dog's head, and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that he'd understand, and everything she felt was already in her hands. When she stood, the dawn had come up fuller, and the snow where the first man had fallen was the only mark on all that white. Cole was already at the truck, already counting what they had left, already a soldier again. Moroni stood with the shotgun pointed at the ground, looking at the tree line where the patient man had vanished, and then he looked at the recording still sitting in Jessica's coat, and at the road that led down toward a courthouse and a chair, and something in the old man's face that had been clenched for a very long time came loose. "All right," Sal Morone said. "All right, I'll talk. Get me to that chair, and I'll give them all of it." He looked at the dog. "Your animal there bought an old man 8 more days. Seems wrong to waste them being a coward." They had the tape. They had the prosecutor. And now, at last, they had the man. 3 walls, and someone had just handed them the floor. The last 8 days did not feel like a race anymore. They felt like a thing being carried, carefully, by people who had finally stopped dropping it. They did not do it alone, and that was the part Jessica would think about long after. The moment they had all 3 pieces in the same place, the calculus that Morone had laid out over bitter coffee inverted exactly the way she'd promised it would. A man who is worth more gone is a man in danger. A man whose absence buys nothing is a man nobody bothers to reach for. So she stopped hiding the case and started spending it, one careful handoff at a time, to the few people she had finally decided she could trust, and then to the people those people trusted, until the thing was too large and too witnessed for any single hand inside the system to turn its knob in the dark. The patient man from the past turned up on the 4th day. Not in the snow. In a parking structure 2 states away, picked up on a warrant that came out of Morone's first proffer, sitting in a car with a packed bag and a ticket he never used, because by then the people who'd given him his orders had gone quiet, and a man whose orders go quiet is a man who has been left in the snow himself, in every way that counts. He talked before his lawyer arrived. They almost always did, once they understood they'd been spent. Voss was the one Jessica wanted to be in the room for, and wasn't, and made her peace with. She heard about it secondhand, the way the case described it in the filings. He had walked in certain, the way he'd always walked in, the suit and the easy face and the belief, bone deep, that he was the smartest object in any room he entered. And they had played him the recording, his own voice, smooth and unhurried, explaining what a reputation was worth. And then they had played him the next thing and the next, the timing and the pattern, and the prosecutor who would stand up and name him, until the only man who'd never believed the words were a threat sat listening to a room full of people who heard nothing else. He had built his whole life on the gap between what he said and what he meant. In the end, a small recorder on a table closed that gap, and there was nowhere left for a clever sentence to stand. Caldwell stood up. That was the word for what she did, and Jessica never found a better one. She walked into the thing she'd spent 2 years running from, and she put her name on the truth of it, the form, the envelope, the leash, and the hand that held it. It cost her. The perjury did not vanish because she'd found her spine at the end. The law does not work that way, and she did not ask it to. But there is a difference between a person dragged to the truth and a person who walks to it, and judges can see that difference. And so can the rest of us. She traded the small lie she'd been imprisoned by for a large honesty she chose, and she walked out of the building she'd been afraid of on her own 2 feet, lighter than she'd come in. And Sal Morone took the chair. He did it on the day they'd set for him, 8 days after a dog had bought him the chance to. He sat down, a tired old man, with 3 walls around him, and he simply removed one, the way you'd take down a thing you were finally done holding up, and he gave them all of it. Every name. Every envelope. The whole quiet architecture he'd spent a life building and a final morning deciding to dismantle. When it was done, he was still tired and still old, and he would still answer for the things he'd done. But he answered for them upright, in his own words, and no one ever got the chance to make him have an accident in a cell, because by the time he finished talking, there was no longer any reason in the world to want him gone. They came back to the cabin when it was over. Not because they had to, because none of them, it turned out, quite wanted to be anywhere else yet. The snow had let up. The worst of the winter had cracked while they weren't looking, and the afternoon came in through the cabin window, thin and gold instead of gray, the first honest light in weeks. Jessica made coffee on the old stove, the real kind, slow, and the smell of it filled the small room the way the recording had once filled it, except this filled it with something else entirely. She handed Cole a cup. He wrapped both hands around it, the way a man does when he's spent too many nights cold. Marone's absence sat in the room with them, not heavy, just present, an old man somewhere warm and accounted for. Caldwell had her own road now. The case had grown past all of them into the thing it should have been from the start, large and loud and out of any one person's hands. Jessica took the first sip and felt it go all the way down, bitter and hot and good, the heat of it reaching some cold place that the blankets and the fire all those days ago had never quite gotten to. She had spent 11 days up here trying not to think about the thing that had broken her faith. She had come down knowing it could break, and knowing, too, that it could be put back together by hand, by enough hands, if the people holding it decided to. That was not the same as believing the system was good. It was better than that. It was knowing what it took to make it work, and being willing to be one of the hands. "You're going back," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah?" She turned the cup in her hands. "Different, though. I know what I'm walking back into now. I don't think I did before." She looked at him. "What about you? Contractors got no reason to stay in a town this cold." Cole didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the gold light on the snow, and then down at the floor by the stove, where Wren lay stretched full length in the warmth, watching the two of them the way he watched everything, taking the measure of it. "There was a guy on my team years back," Cole said. "We had a rule. You don't leave anybody. Doesn't matter the cost, doesn't matter the math. You go back and you get them." He turned the cup. "I broke that rule once, not on purpose. The math just got away from me, and somebody got left, and I told myself afterward that the smart thing was to never get close enough to owe anybody that again." He set the cup down. "Then a dog dug me out of a snowbank, and a Fed, who was supposed to be on leave, decided not to make the easy call, and nobody got left." He shrugged, and it cost his ribs something, and he didn't seem to mind. "Turns out I'm bad at staying away from people. Always was. I just got good at pretending." Wren rose from the floor, unhurried, and crossed the small space, and put his head down across Cole's knee. Not Jessica's. Cole's. The man who, 10 days ago, the dog would not stop growling at. Jessica watched it and felt something settle that had been loose in her for longer than 11 days. "He found you, you know," she said. "Out there. He didn't have to. We were a mile out, downwind, and he just stopped, turned, went off the trail like somebody had called him." She scratched the dog behind one ear. "I've worked with him for 4 years. I still couldn't tell you how he knew there was anything to find." "He didn't know," Cole said. He rested a hand on the broad head against his knee. "He just paid attention to something the rest of us had quit listening for." Outside, the light moved gold across the snow, and the pines stood easy under it, and somewhere down the mountain, a system that had nearly swallowed all of them was busy, at last, doing the thing it was built to do, because enough people had decided to make it. And in the warm, small room, a woman who had stopped believing, and a man who had stopped getting close, and a dog who had never stopped listening, sat together in the first gold light of a winter that was finally beginning to let go. And none of them, for once, was waiting for anything at all. Sometimes the thing that saves us isn't a system or a sentence or a man in a chair. Sometimes it's a creature who pays attention to what we've stopped hearing, who goes off the trail when something calls, who digs in the cold until he finds the person nobody else knew was there. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it teaches the rest of us to listen again. When the last name had been spoken and the last door had closed, the thing most people remembered wasn't the lawyer who fell, or the prosecutor who finally stood up, or the old man who took down a wall he'd spent his life holding. What they remembered was the dog, because everyone in this story was an expert at not listening. Adrian Voss spent his whole life talking and never once heard the threat in his own voice. Renee Caldwell read the words under penalty of perjury 10,000 times and stopped hearing them until the day they closed around her own wrist. Sal Marone held 100 secrets so tightly he forgot the sound of his own. And Jessica Hayes had come up a mountain because she could no longer bear to hear the system she believed in. Every single one of them had gone deaf to something that mattered. Ryn hadn't. A mile out, downwind, with nothing to go on, he stopped on the trail and turned, because he had never learned to quit paying attention to the world the way the rest of us do. He didn't know there was a man in the snow. He simply listened in a place the rest of us had stopped looking, and a life that was nearly over became a life that wasn't. Maybe that's the part worth carrying out of here. Not the crime, not the courtroom. The listening. Because every one of us walks past someone, downwind and out of sight, who is waiting to be found. A friend who has gone quiet. A parent we keep meaning to call. A person sitting right beside us, saying the thing they mean in words we've decided not to hear. You don't need a badge or a witness chair to change that. You just need to stop, the way Ryn stopped, and turn toward the thing you've been walking past. Today, reach out to the one person you've gone a little deaf to. Make the call. Ask the real question. Listen for what they aren't quite saying. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to be heard today. Tell me in the comments about a time someone found you when you didn't think anyone was looking. And if you believe the quiet ones are worth listening for, subscribe and stay with us, because there are more of these stories to tell and more people waiting to be found.